So the start of the latest Olympics has been thrown into chaos in France because of arson against French rail service. And it just exemplifies how it only takes a tiny number of people to absolutely wreak havoc. We had 15 hijackers on 9/11 who immediately caused billions of dollars worth of damage to the American economy, and then precipitated bad decisions on the part of America that cost the economy another $7 trillion. Now, to the best of my knowledge, every major hijacking we've had since mid-1970s has been by by Islamic terrorists. So maybe that should be taken into account when profiling people who are likely to commit hijacking or to commit crime. We saw the destructiveness and the criminality and the anti-police violence displayed on the part of the pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas protesters in Washington, D.C. yesterday, where they were burning the American flag. All right. So the leaders of the Palestinians have displayed little interest in building up the Palestinian people. Right, their only accomplishment has been in killing Jews. So the Palestinians depend almost entirely on foreign aid. Right, they don't stand on their own 2 feet, and their leadership has no interest in developing a coherent, productive people. Right, what exactly have Palestinians contributed to the world except endless amounts of terror and destruction? And so we'll learn a great deal about the people who committed this arson in France, delaying the start of the Olympics. And they will reflect on the group that they support, just as these pro-Palestine protesters are a pretty good reflection of the pro-Palestine crowd, which overwhelmingly around the world comes from a Leninist Marxist perspective that the oppressed people of brown color are good and valiant and are freed from all moral constraints. Well, if people are white or European and they've built productive societies, then they're the bad guys. And so the normal rules of law don't apply to oppressed people of color who are fighting against what Lenin calls, capitalist imperialism. And as soon as you allow people off the hook for any kind of moral restraint, then you are encouraging a particularly destructive bunch of people. And yet this has the overwhelming support of most countries in the United Nations, which is so fixated on Israel fighting to defend itself, and a substantial support from Western elite. Western elite support, by and large, the pro-Palestine protesters that we saw wreaking destruction in Washington, D.C. and tearing down the flag, because from an elite perspective, the flag isn't sacred. The flag is only a symbol. But for people on the right, for people who are conservative and patriotic and nationalist, the flag is not just a symbol. The flag is something that is sacred, and when it is burnt, when it is wantonly destroyed, when it is trod upon, right, it causes real synaptic pain to people. So the elite position is to try to be above it all with this careful, critical discourse, to just understand flags and patriotism. These are just symbols. And we should have a more elevated, rarefied understanding. While the people who are on the right, we're a little bit more medieval. Right, we are more visceral. We don't censor our visceral reactions. Right, we're more likely to use bad words like senile and retarded when appropriate. We recognize in-groups and out-groups. We're more likely to want to punish people who do things like burn the American flag and fight cops. Right, Washington, D.C. is a 90% black population that overwhelmingly elects left-wing Democrats who have no interest in enforcing most laws. And so those protesters who are beating cops and burning the flag and defacing America's sacred monuments, charges are being dropped against those who've been arrested. because that's reflective of much of the dominant elite perspective that you don't punish criminals, you rehabilitate them. To be on the right means that you want to punish norm violators. You want to punish people who do bad things, destructive things. And it only takes a tiny number of people to wreak havoc, right? It took 15 hijackers on 9/11 to destroy life as we know it in the United States and impose untold costs on people who travel after that. It only takes one bad driver to shut down a freeway and cost 10,000, 100,000 productive hours for productive law-abiding citizens. So that's why it's so important to have very careful immigration policies. As Steve Saylor says, we should have an immigration review board whenever we find that we've got an immigrant who has committed a dastardly murderous act or is destroying life as we know it. Then we should have an immigration review board to review why did we allow this person in our country. We should be very careful about who we allow into our country because it only takes one person to wreak untold amounts of havoc. Right, think about October 7, 2023 in Israel. Right, no country can afford to keep the number of military on its borders to protect it from an invasion. Right, if drug warlords wanted to in Mexico, they could assemble hundreds of fighters that could flood into the United States and kill thousands of American civilians. Now, the reason that most countries don't invade other countries like Hamas did against Israel on October 7, 2023 is because of the massive consequences. Right, you had Arabs invading Israel during the 1950s on a routine basis, just slaughtering Israeli civilians. And the only way that was stopped because Israel retaliated hard. Right? You got to punish people who do bad things. You got to punish them hard. Right? You could have terrorists set up with machine guns in American shopping malls and bring life to a halt and just take a tiny number of people. And there may be only one way to effectively stop terrorism, and it's going to make you squeamish. You're not going to like it. You're not going to approve it. It sounds incredibly immoral. But the only way to stop this kind of Islamic terror is to severely punish the female members of the family of these Islamic terrorists. Right? If you employed certain severe punishments against the terrorist's mother, sister, nieces, aunties, right, that would effectively deter Islamic terror. But most Western countries are way too squeamish to punish like this. This is why I make the case for vouch nationalism, that you should have to have a certain number of law-abiding adults vouch for you to have privileges, such as a driver's license, to be able to fly in a plane, maybe even to step into certain areas, such as, say, Beverly Hills or Manhattan, where there's a tremendous amount of wealth and there are a lot of intricate, important operations going on. Right? Maybe you should have to have at least 10 law-abiding adults who vouch for you. And then if you commit a heinous act with this privilege, say of owning a gun or stepping into valuable territory, then everyone who vouched for you should have to share in your punishment. Right? We need to get more collective. There are many virtues to America's individualist attitude where we just judge people on the basis of their own actions. But that's not how the world works. The world overwhelmingly works in a collective fashion. Right? In America, we use all this rhetoric about the wonders of democracy, how democracy is on the ballot, and whether or not this or that is democratic. And it's not how the world works. The world works overwhelmingly on hierarchical, authoritarian lines. Think about you going to work, right? Work is not operated on the basis of democracy. You have essentially a dictator, and you are essentially a slave. You consent to be a slave in a normal job, 40 hours a week. You go in there and you take orders from a hierarchical chain of command. Same with education, right? You go to school, it's not a democracy. So almost none of life runs on democratic lines. Now, I think it's great that we get to vote for our elected representatives, but I recognize that almost none of life runs on democratic lines. And there are many beauties to an individualist perspective on life, but that's not how the world works. If you have 5 unpleasant interactions with 5 different members of a minority group, you are very likely to develop negative feelings about that group, whether it's Jews or gays or blacks or Mexicans or Palestinians. Right? If you have enough negative experiences with members of a certain group, you will grow to detest, or at least have reservations about that group as a whole. Right? That's how the world works. We don't have infinite amount of capacity for cognitive deductions. Right? We use heuristics, these good enough decision-making models. And so if we see people, running in a particular direction and screaming that there's, someone out to kill them, then you take notice of that, and you follow the crowd, because you're going to be better doing that than trying to independently assess the situation and make your own decision. And so we have to get more collective in our punishment. And I agree with Israel's policy of when you have Palestinian terrorism, right, you destroy the home of that Palestinian terrorist. And maybe you need to imprison the family and severely punish the female members of that family, because Islamic terrorists will find that the strongest deterrent. There was a professor, I believe, at Bar-Ilan University who said the only way that you can effectively deter Islamic terrorism is to, God forbid, rape the female members of that terrorist family. So what is your top priority? Is your top priority preserving liberal notions of human rights, where everyone is treated on an individualist basis, right? Liberalism is inherently an individualist, rights-based perspective. Or do you want to look at the world through a more nationalist lens, right? Nationalism is the most powerful political force in the last 200 years. It remains the most powerful political force. So maybe communities that are consistently destructive, they need to start paying the price for the bad behavior of their individual members. Right? It makes sense that people are concerned when they see somebody who's part of a group that commits a disproportionate amount of crime, right? When you see a young black man dressed in gang regalia, right, he's more likely to act out in some kind of violent crime than a young black man dressed in a business suit, as opposed to an old Asian lady, as opposed to a Latino mother of 5 who's 40 years of age. Right? Men commit far more violent crimes than women. Right? Some groups commit far more violent crimes than other groups. And it would make sense to note that. And so I don't see why profiling is such a bad thing, whether it's on religion, ethnicity, race, if it aligns with the facts. And I suspect that the people who committed the arson on the French railroads were not your 5 generations going back Frenchmen. And the United States has no control over its southern border. We're allowing in millions of people into this country illegally, and then they are often causing havoc. And that's insane. You cannot preserve any kind of civilization while having open borders. So J.D. Vance is under tremendous attack for a comment he made on Tucker Carlson's show about how this country is run by childless cat ladies who are miserable in their own lives, and now they want to make the rest of the country miserable too. And I've been listening to Mark Halperin's show, where Mark Halperin and various guests are saying this is devastating for Donald Trump's chances this fall. This is terrible news for Republicans, and that even conservative women are up in arms. And I don't buy it. Right? If you are looking to be outraged, if you're looking to be angry at J.D. Vance or the Republicans, you can always find an opportunity to get angry at someone. Right? There's no inherent reason why a normal person with concerns primarily about their family, about their work, about their education, about their church, right, is going to have time or the emotional and cognitive energy to get outraged by J.D. Vance's comments that this country is run by childless cat women. And I think he's absolutely right that miserable people want to make other people miserable. I notice this all the time in my live streaming. When I talk to people who are miserable, they tend to interpret every news event as reinforcing and re-justifying their misery. While for me, I'm a happy guy, and I have a different bias. I try to understand the news in terms that will maintain and even strengthen my happiness level. So whatever you are, it's going to have a profound effect on your politics. Right? If you are miserable, you're going to be more likely to seek apocalyptic solutions in politics. You're more likely to put a greater stress on the importance of politics. I remember about 8 years ago, my therapist said to me, do you think you're so radical in your politics because you're so passive in your life? If you're losing at life, if you're not building anything, if you're not earning, if you're not developing the respect of your peers, if you're not living in an esteemed position in your community, if you're not building your skills, right, if you're not operating your life in a productive way that is increasing your connection with the people who most matter to you, then you're going to look for some messianic, eschatological, apocalyptic, cataclysmic justification for your misery. You're going to strongly want to locate the source of your misery outside of you. So the people who are most involved in left-wing activism or far-right activism overwhelmingly tend to be miserable people. Right? It's their misery that drives them into radical politics. It's the passivity with which they approach their adult responsibilities that drives them into political activism like Black Lives Matter or Antifa or the alt-right, following people like Nick Fuentes and Richard Spencer. Right? If you're a dentist, a doctor, if you're a professional, if you're a CEO, if you are earning $1 million a year, you have no interest in these radical causes. Right? The better your life is, the more likely you are to be invested in the status quo, in protecting what you've got. And I think much of the opposition to J.D. Vance is based on his formidable capability. Right? This is a man who is building a counter-elite. Right? He is helping to assemble significant funding for the Trump campaign from Silicon Valley. He has significant following among right-wing intellectuals. Right? The Republican Party has a severe competency crisis because the managerial elite are now overwhelmingly on the left. Federal government employees donate 97% of the time to Democrats, not to Republicans. Right? The people who go to and graduate from our elite universities are overwhelmingly on the left. And as the Republicans have become the party of the working class, as they become increasingly populist, then they have steadily grown apart from our most competent, our most educated, our highest IQ elite. And you need the elite if you're going to run America, right? The new Trump administration, provided he wins in November, we need 50,000 new civil servants to take over the reins of the federal government and to run it effectively. Unfortunately, Donald Trump doesn't have much of a track record at running things effectively. So his administration has to attract people who are good at running things effectively. And it's J.D. Vance who's going to bring in this counter-elite, right? He's got the outreach to right-wing intellectuals that he's been building over the past few years. He wrote a best-selling book. And he's a thoughtful man married to a brilliant woman. And if the new Trump administration is going to succeed and make a real difference in the real world, right, they are going to need the skills and the contacts that J.D. Vance brings to the table. I love the dissident right-wing thinkers that J.D. Vance follows on Twitter, such as Lomez, who is Steve Saylor's publisher. J.D. Vance also follows Steve Saylor. I noticed that Tucker Carlson's podcast has recently become the #1 podcast in the world. So a lot of what Tucker Carlson says is stupid and low IQ. But he also does brave dissident right critiques. So he's both consistently stupid and moronic and brave and insightful. People are a mixed bag, right? No one is honest and upright and righteous, usually in all of their dealings. People are usually good in one area of life and terrible in another area of life. So I'm seeing now a lot of right-wing critiques that Kamala Harris is an opportunist. And I think that's accurate. Kamala Harris is an opportunist. When she first ran for San Francisco District Attorney, she ran against the incumbent San Francisco District Attorney who was effectively a communist and wasn't punishing criminals. And she ran as a tough-on-crime prosecutor. And she repeatedly did that in California. She ran as a tough-on-crime prosecutor because, in large part, she saw that as a winning message. And it was a winning message. Then in 2019, she completely reversed herself, and she sided with Black Lives Matter, and she sided with the left when she was seeking the Democratic Party nomination. So overall, her track record in the U.S. Senate shows that she's the most liberal senator. But when she was operating in California, she frequently won by running to the right of her Democratic opponents. She has strong ties with parts of Silicon Valley. Reid Hoffman of Netflix just donated $7 million to her. So is Kamala Harris some extreme left-winger? Is she moderate? Well, she's opportunist, right? Who she is depends on the situation, and that gets to the deeper truth that who each of us is depends on the situation. Right? If we're surrounded by conservative Christians, we are going to speak differently and act differently. If we are surrounded by edgy stand-up comics, right, we're going to speak differently and act differently. Right? Who we are at work is often quite different from who we are in church, from who we are in a sports bar, who we are in a sports stadium, who we are in synagogue, who we are at a bank. Right? The situation is often going to have more of an effect on our behavior than any inherent quality that we might have. Right? Some of us might be extroverted in some situations, introverted in other situations. Right? We're going to be loud and making jokes, perhaps at the bar, and careful and constrained when we're at church. So, yeah, Kamala Harris is an opportunist. J.D. Vance is an opportunist, but I see that as a good thing. Right? When you take advantage of opportunities, that's a good thing. Now, if taking advantage of opportunities means that you sell out your best interests, such as you alienate your closest friends, your family, your in-group, your church, your synagogue, right, by your pursuit of opportunities, then I really don't see that as an opportunity. Right? Taking advantage of an opportunity that costs you connection with the people most important to you is no opportunity. So to the extent that J.D. Vance and Kamala Harris have been opportunistic, I think it's a good thing. They've been responding to incentives, and it seems that Kamala Harris has a pretty effective team that's now operating her. So she's coming out with canny statements. I see the Biden administration just decided against two different affirmative action challenges. They decided against the federal government pursuing two challenges on behalf of affirmative action. So when Joe Biden took office in 2021, right, he was all into promoting affirmative action, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now the legal ground has changed and the political ground has changed. So I see both the Biden administration and Kamala Harris tacking to the right to try to appeal to the swing voters in the essential states of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. And I think Kamala Harris and the Democrats are running a pretty effective campaign so far, very early days. And so far the media has only given her adulatory coverage. But as Mark Halperin says, she's won the Newsday 5 days in a row now. So I think she'll be a formidable candidate. And so one common blind spot that I see on both the right and the left is thinking that the other political side is just filled with bad people. So whether it's Hillary Clinton describing Donald Trump supporters as deplorable, or many people on the right thinking that people on the left are just opportunist, hive-minded, conformist, unreliable. I don't think it's true, right? Someone with your level of IQ on the other side of the political spectrum is probably no more likely to commit crime than you are. They're just as likely to be a good neighbor as you are. So this is the advantage of taking the genetic perspective on life, right? We develop these differing political impulses. So on the right, impulses towards hierarchy, impulses towards severely punishing norm violators, impulses towards maintaining traditional ways of doing things, right? It's better than new, innovative ways of organizing family and community, right? These are right-wing impulses, and less of a desire to spread out resources in an egalitarian fashion. While on the left, you have impulses going back thousands of years towards less severe punishment for norm violators, for more even distribution of resources, for more innovative ways of organizing families and communities. And we have these two impulses because in different circumstances, each has been an effective evolutionary strategy to propagate your seed into a new generation. So there are going to be circumstances where having a xenophobic police state will be the most effective way to survive a particular challenge. And so the right-wing xenophobic police state, authoritarian hierarchical tendencies will be more effective than left-wing egalitarian openness to outgroups tendencies. Right? There are going to be some circumstances where severely punishing norm violators will be more effective, and other circumstances where less severe punishment and more rehabilitation will be more effective. So conservatives, for example, are more likely to take notice of bad things that you've done in your past and to consider that these may very well be predictive of how you will behave in the future. Conservatives are much more likely to do this than libertarians, people in the center, and people on the left. And so there are probably strong evolutionary benefits for taking into consideration people's past behavior and its likely effect, predictive ability to more accurately discern prudent ways to live. So when you understand that our political impulses are in all likelihood significantly genetic, right? There's a terrific book on this. It's now out in its second edition called Predisposed. It's about the genetic basis of people's political impulses. Right? When you understand that much of who we are comes from our genetics, then you're less likely to take it personally when other people have a different hero system from you, have a different political ideology, and you're less likely to want to write off your enemies as simply bad people. When you take the genetic perspective, it's much easier to recognize that your opponents simply come from a different genetic code than you, and they've likely had different life experiences, and that these two factors, right, genetics and imprinting, right, have made them who they are, just as genetics and imprinting have made you as you are. Because your political opponents are no more likely to be bad than you are. Everybody's a mixed bag. Right? Plenty of people on the right are dishonest, dishonorable. Plenty of people on the left are dishonest and dishonorable. But overall, you'll find that the moral caliber of behavior by people on different sides of the political spectrum will pretty much accord with their IQ. So 140 IQ right-wing people, right, are going to be unlikely to commit crimes, just as 140 IQ left-wing people are going to be unlikely to commit crimes. Right? Highly educated liberal left elites who go to the elite schools, very likely to live conservative lives, right? They're very likely to be married with children. So I think there's strong empirical basis for recognizing that high IQ people are more likely to contribute to the tax base than take money out in social welfare, that they're at a low likelihood of committing crime, that they're a high likelihood of innovation and creation and entrepreneurship and discovery and driving our society forward and making substantial contributions. And the higher the IQ, the more likely they are to contribute to society, whether these people are on the left or the right. And so I think there's a strong empirical basis for my recognition that people on the left and right with equivalent levels of IQ are approximately similar in their individual morality. But more important, or just as importantly, it's a really useful basis for analyzing life, because you reduce the need to dismiss vast swaths of people just because you disagree with them. Right? It's a good way to go through life instead of viewing your political opponents as bad, as stupid, as deranged, as insane, as sunk in sin, as lost in evil. To recognize that they're people with different genetic structure and different life experiences from you, and that's why they see the world in a different way that you do. Most of us get our hero system, right? Our system of right and wrong, our system of what counts as heroic and what counts as dishonorable, our system of meaning, our system of morality. We almost always get that from our community. And so if you grew up in a different community, you in all likely would have a different hero system. So it's a more even-handed, objective way to try to analyze the world around you. Yeah, obsession with politics can be bad for your mental health. And you see this particularly on the left, right? Left-wing political activists overwhelmingly tend to be mentally ill, sad, depressed, right? Not doing well in their real life. And they're trying to make up for their inner emptiness, their lack of human connection and building a sustainable life by throwing themselves into left-wing activism. So that's why Mark Halperin fears a left-wing mental health collapse should Donald Trump win, because the left-wing has so much invested in politics, while right-wingers are not nearly as invested in politics. Their lives will go on. Donald Trump loses. They'll just return their focus to their family, to their religion, to their hobbies.